Thank you again, Dr. Stone, for joining us tonight. For those of you who I haven't had the opportunity to meet or work with previously, my name is Jason Feynman. I'm one of the current third year cardiology fellows at Mount Sinai Hospital. Like I'm going to said, I was honored to be one of the original members of the Cardio Nerds Clinical Trials Network within the Paraglide HF study, and very fortunate to help to coordinate some of these lectures for the next iteration of the group within the Empower and the Zeus trials. I think we're incredibly fortunate tonight to be joined by Dr. Gregg Stone. Dr. Stone really is a pioneer in the field of both cardiology and interventional cardiology as a whole. He's been the principal investigator of over 140 national and international multi-center trials, and this includes things like COAPT and Excel and ischemia. He's authored thousands of abstracts and manuscripts, and is consistently, one of the most cited researchers worldwide. I've had the great pleasure of getting to know and hear from him a lot over the past 3 years at Mount Sinai during my fellowship, and know that he's a fantastic person for us all to hear from and learn from as we discuss some careers in clinical research. So, Dr. Stone, we have a group here of both fellows and interim medicine residents and trainees at all stages, and we'd love to just hear a little bit about how you got your start in clinical trial work and clinical research.
Sure. I'm happy to. A real pleasure to be here. And I'd love to hear where everybody is from, but I don't want to take that much time. So, and what I'd love to do is make this, a discussion and make it collaborative. So maybe I think we have an hour, right? So, maybe I'll talk half the time, but I want to hear from all of you and what your burning questions and issues are. So, I'm happy to talk about a lot of my history, and I think some of my history is relevant. A fair amount of it's probably still relevant to developing a career in clinical research, but some of it is less relevant because the times are very different. And we live in a different era in terms of clinical research, especially in cardiology. It's much more advanced right now and much more sophisticated compared to when I was getting started. So first of all, let me, kind of give you a prelude that when you think about an academic career, or at least when I think about a clinician who is really at the top of their game in terms of accomplishing and making the most contributions to medicine, you always think of three different buckets. And it all starts around clinical care. It's really hard to do clinical research unless you are a great clinician. And that sounds trite, but it's actually taking care of patients and seeing what works and what doesn't is where you gain the insights to understand where the unmet clinical needs are and where the gaps in medical evidence are. And that lets you develop hypotheses and you become an independent thinker and researcher. So it really all starts with the patient. And you also have to help develop trials that are, and this has been focused on a lot in the most recent discussions about the heart team. But we always say the patient is at the center of the heart team. And medicine used to be a much more parochial business where the doctor would know what was best for the patient. And how could patients possibly have enough of a wealth of knowledge to make the right decisions for themselves? And I think we've transitioned to an era where, our goal is to facilitate the care that the patient needs so we can help meet the patient's life goals. And we have to understand what's important to the patient, where they are, where they want to get. Are procedures terrifying to them? We have to take that into account. Are they looking at short-term outcomes, at long-term outcomes? Do they care about quality of life more than quantity of life? All of those things have to be front and center. And you need to understand those issues from talking with patients and taking care of patients to be able to design the current era of modern trials where we're shifting from, again, a very physician-oriented outcomes to more patient-centered outcomes. So the first bucket is clinical care. Then the second bucket is research. And, you can roughly break research down into basic science research, classic running a laboratory, doing either preclinical or animal investigation, or then you can think of clinical or human research. It's very hard to do both. And when you're taking care of patients and spending a fair amount of time doing that, I can tell you it's very hard to do basic science research. Basic science research is really a full-time job. I know a few people that I can count on one hand who have actually run a successful lab while taking care of patients, but it's very, very difficult to do. It's much more common where you can excel in clinical research. And then there's a whole varieties of clinical research that I can talk about. And while you are doing patient care. And then the third, which links to both, is education, right? So, we consider it an honor and a humbling responsibility to be able to disseminate the knowledge that we've developed and impart that knowledge on to our peers, both at our similar age groups and even more advanced age groups, down to junior faculty, fellows, residents, medical students, et cetera, and to really train the next generation, train not only their knowledge base, but also their thought processes so they can become independent thinkers and researchers. So I can tell you that the first very, very important thing that you have to do is to decide what's going to make you happy. And you've got to be honest with yourselves. We need great clinicians. And most physicians that we train in the US are only going to be physicians, are only going to be caregivers. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's a fantastic life. But if you want to, if you're really fascinated by, answering questions and by saying, I just don't want to become the best practitioner and take care of patients, but I also want to delve in the unknown, and become a clinical researcher. For me, that's been a great career choice because it keeps things incredibly fresh. Because I can tell you, I came out of my fellowship thinking I knew almost everything there was to know. And every year that's gone by up until the present, and it's going to be true next year more than this year, I realize there is less and less that I really know, and that there's so much that needs to be understood and explored. And I can tell you, when I think back to, I went to Johns Hopkins Medical School. When I think back to what I learned in medical school and then what I applied in my internship and residency, I probably about 30% or 40% of that core of knowledge is still relevant, and probably about 10% of the therapies. So in about a 35-year career, it's turned over 2 or 3 times. So you've got to figure out, even if all you're going to do is take care of patients, you've got to figure out how to keep yourself educated, how to teach others and get taught, because medicine is constantly evolving. And if you don't keep up, you're going to get buried and you're not going to be a very good physician. So that's a long kind of preamble to get to how I started. I was very interested in investigation and research, and very interested in taking care of patients from a very, very early age. And I won't get into why I got interested in medicine, but I will talk about how I got involved in clinical research. I started in college, and that was the first time I did any research, and I sought out a mentor. And this was a mentor who was running a basic science laboratory on some unheard of back then. This was at the University of Michigan in 1976. So go blue. Okay. For those of you who are football fans, there you go. And I sought out a mentor who was working on some unknown thing called prostaglandins. Okay. And we don't have time for me to tell the whole story, but did basic science research with him for 2 years. And then when I went to medical school, I wanted to do clinical research. And so,
Yeah, me
while I
too.
was,
I
uh,
forgot to, yes.
oh, I'm sorry, maybe everyone can go on mute who's not talking, and then we'll unmute during discussion. And so I, again, sought out mentors and actually worked on the first implantable cardiac defibrillator, which some of you may remember. It was developed by Michelle Morawski at Johns Hopkins. And I got to do some of the basic science work on that. We were testing the defibrillator in fish aquarium to see if it would be inviolate to a saline environment, et cetera. Became a reader. I was a medical student, became a reader of electrophysiology studies. Thought I was going to be an electrophysiologist. It was so fun and exciting. Um, and then, when I became an intern and resident, I also looked for mentors and wanted to do clinical research. and this was at Cornell, and was doing heart failure research. Okay, for a couple of years, and then during my fellowship, I did a lot of research, and I started to do. I've got mentors first in nuclear cardiology, and did a whole bunch of nuclear cardiology projects, including developing some new tools and ways to look at diastolic dysfunction. And then got very interested in this relatively new subspecialty called interventional cardiology. Started to do some research there, then got accepted into an advanced interventional cardiology fellowship with one of the real leaders in the field, and just took off from there. So, so I had a great underpinning, and the real lessons there were to one, find the right mentors. Okay, and it's really, really key to you may not know early on what you're interested in. You may not know it's cardiology. If it's cardiology, you may not know if it's echo and imaging, or if it's preventative cardiology or interventional cardiology. You may not know, but try to see what excites you and what interests you, and then try to find a mentor who will have the time and the bandwidth and who wants to teach young people. And that can be a hard thing to do. We can maybe talk in the discussion a little bit about how to do it, but a lot of it is by word of mouth. And you go by the strengths of who the people are at the particular institution that you're at, et cetera. But nobody does this on their own. Everybody does it by, working with great people and learning with great people. And you want people that are generous enough, that are going to give you time, that are going to teach you, and that'll let you going to be part of a collaborative team in research, and then ultimately will let you lead some types of projects, whether they're only case reports or, whether they're small sub-studies and projects, or other, type of initiatives. Then the interesting thing is when you get out of your fellowship, what you do. And, then you're starting to become now an independent researcher. That's at least what you want to become. And, then finding a job is really, really critical. And that goes to the fact, a little bit, and this kind of talks to the evolution of the way things are and were. Back when I was leaving my fellowship, my two fellowships, and then going into practice, wanting to do interventional cardiology research, that was mostly done in the private practice setting. Interventional cardiology was new enough. The people that were really doing it, that were pushing the envelope, were not university based. They were in large private practices. They were getting thousands of patients referred to them from all over the world. And they had clinical databases that they had set up. And that's where all the patient information was. And that's where the research was coming from. It wasn't coming from Harvard and Stanford and Columbia and Cornell and, Mount Sinai and all those places. Over the years, that has changed. And now it's not only interventional cardiology, but it's most cardiology research, and probably most other subspecialties as well, where things have gotten much more coordinated and are much more university based. So the question is, there are still some big private practices that are doing a lot of clinical research, because some big private practices that still control a lot of patients, and so may enroll a lot of patients in clinical research. There can be some great academicians that are working at those private practices and can have a lot of sway, both with industry and with government, because frankly, they've got control over a large patient cohort. And there's a lot of value to being a person who will actively work on clinical studies to identify the right kinds of patients and spend the time to speak to those patients and enroll them into clinical studies. So I'll get back to that in a minute. So really now, most of the top clinical research is going to be university-based, or medical school-based. Not all, but most. If you're interested in a private practice setting, where salaries still tend to be somewhat higher, you can find it, but you've got to really ask around. There are fewer large practices that would do it, because a lot of the large practices have been bought up by hospitals. There's two kinds of research, basically. To do clinical research, it's one thing to have an idea, but it's got to get funded. And that's probably, unfortunately, kind of front and center of the first decision that's always got to be made. And there's two main sources of funding. and that's either industry or government. And government is mostly NIH, although we recently received a very large grant from PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which is a different branch of government, not NIH. There's AHRQ and there's other government branches, and they fund a lot of research, although probably about 3/4 of what the government funds is basic science research. So there's less clinical research that they fund, although they still do fund a fair amount of clinical research. Most clinical research in this country gets funded through industry. And the kinds of clinical research projects that are done from industry and government are very, very different. The beauty of working with government projects is that there is no, quote, inherent bias. And you can ask strategy questions for which there's no inherent commercial interest in, whether it's PCI versus cabbage or preventative care versus revascularization or something like that. Intensive versus mild exercise. Industry is not going to sponsor studies like that. The downside of working with NIH or other government agencies to do clinical research is that you'll spend 6 months putting together a grant. You'll spend a month of your life putting together a grant. The grant application is very thick. It's very intense. You do a huge amount of work. They fund about, depending on how big a grant you want, 10% of projects to get submitted. They're almost never funded on the first go around. If you're lucky enough, you get a good enough score that you have to reapply again. And so they'll be funded in year 2 instead of year 1. And the funding is never enough. Government projects tend to be under-resourced, and you have to make a lot of compromises in your clinical research. Then there's industry. The beauty of industry is that, I can write a, quote, grant proposal for industry, which will be a 3 or 4 page proposal, which I can knock off in an evening in a thoughtful way. And, I might find out within 2 to 3 weeks, and I might have a 50-50 chance of getting it funded. And sometimes it can be for a large amount of money. The downside of industry, of course, is that industry is driven by their commercial interests. They're beholden to their stockholders, and that's their number one goal for established companies and startup companies. They want to be bought or become public. So you've always got to keep that in mind. And I've done a lot of work with industry, and there's nothing wrong with it, but you've got to figure out ways of working with industry so you can make your interests, which are to answer scientific questions that are going to help patients, overlap with their interests, which is to sell drugs and devices or diagnostics. And for me, I've never had a problem with that because as physicians, we need the tools that industry is making, whether they're diagnostics, drugs, or devices, to help our patients get better. And I believe in American capitalism, and frankly, if industry can develop a new device or a new drug that's going to save lives and improve patients' lives, then good for them. And I have no trouble with them financially benefiting from that, as long as I get to be open and honest and design and run the kind of study that I want. It's an unbiased study, which will prove whether or not patients can safely and effectively benefit from those therapies. And so I've been able to, work that tightrope, very, very effectively. The other big advantage of working with industry is that the research tends to be much better resourced. And it's got to pass the scrutiny in most projects of the FDA. The FDA is a fantastic organization, and they will come in and they will look at every single keystroke. Every research keystroke is recorded, and they'll see who had the passcode to push that key. And they will recreate all of the data, and they'll recreate all of the statistics, and they'll recreate your analyses. And so there's no hiding from the FDA. And because of that, the level of rigor that's required in industry studies is incredibly high. And so frankly, and this is a misconception, I could spend an hour talking about this, industry studies are actually, in general, much higher quality studies than most, not all, but most government studies for that kind of reason. although you always have to worry about hidden biases. So the bottom line is when you come out, you don't have to choose, am I going to be an industry researcher or am I going to be a government researcher? But you do have to know a little bit where your salary is going to come from. And if you think, one way to do it is to, apply to programs that will give you protected time. And again, if you take my advice and you want to be a clinician, you're going to say, I want to see patients 2 or 3 days a week. Let's say 3 days a week. And then 2 days a week, I want to do protected research. And so then they're going to ask you, okay, well, how are you going to pay for those 2 days? Okay. And the usual way that younger investigators will pay for the 2 days a week is to apply for grants. And that's usually going to be industry grants. So you do have to keep that kind of in mind. But let's say you're in a program, and let's say your primary job is clinical, and you want to transition slowly from being principally a clinician to becoming an academic clinical leader 10 years from now, or 5 or 15 years from now. So again, you want to find mentors and you want to find the people that are doing the research. This is all about collaboration. And you want to start by, being a site or being a participant in usually multi-center clinical trials. And that's a great way to learn about clinical research and to learn about, new devices, new drugs, new strategies, to enroll patients, to meet with the patients, talk to them, hear what their concerns are, answer the questions, be knowledgeable enough so you can make a contribution to those studies. And if you can become 1 site out of 50, and you can be the 4th highest enroller in that study, 1, you'll get your name on all the principal publications that come out, and 2, you'll get noticed. Okay. And, by making that kind of effort, whether it was industry who funded you or whether it was government that now you've got some credit, with future government grants, it's going to go a long way for you taking the next step. So the first step is, you may be one person on a team with your site being 1 site out of 50. Then the next trial, you may be the lead principal investigator at your site, 1 site out of 50. And then the next trial, now there's something either newer and earlier, and there's only going to be 3 clinical sites, but you've developed relationships because you've met all the other leaders from the other trials, and they see how hard you work and how bright you are. And so they want you to be one of the 3 sites that are going to get an early stage investigation. And by doing this and by presenting abstracts and then writing up sub-studies, writing review articles, writing case reports, you're going to get known. And then ultimately, when you start developing ideas, then you're going to submit ideas to either NIH or to industry, and you'll get funded with increasingly large grants over time. So it doesn't happen overnight. It's impossible to happen overnight. There certainly are some programs that are really centered around developing clinical researchers. Obviously some of the Harvard programs, Duke, Columbia, Mount Sinai. I mean, there's programs that are known for that, although you can become a clinical researcher from almost anywhere if you've got enough motivation and make enough of an effort. So that's kind of the way I did it, and I'll just close and then let's just open it up for some questions is, I came out, gosh, I'd probably published, I don't know, 25 manuscripts, most as first author by the time I left my fellowship because of having done it for so long, working with so many people. But then, coming out, I was a little, bit of a fish, out of water. And I joined a large practice, clinical practice, because that's where the patients were, in Mountain View, California, and got an adjunct appointment at Stanford and another appointment at another hospital called El Camino, and set up a big research division and started to do a lot of research in a big clinical group that wasn't doing any research. And then kind of got noticed that way. And through my connections from my fellowship, one of the big earliest trials that I got involved in was the PAMI trial. I don't know, has anyone here even heard of the PAMI trial, PAMI? So the PAMI trial was the trial that proved that primary angioplasty reduced death and reinfarction compared to thrombolytic therapy in acute myocardial infarction. And before PAMI, 90%, well, let's say 99.5% of people who had any sort of reperfusion therapy in STEMI got thrombolytic therapy, TPA. And, I in my fellowship, trained with the pioneer who had developed primary PCI. His name was Jeff Hartzler in STEMI, and worked with Bill O'Neill and Cindy Grimes. Beaumont, this is Beaumont Hospital, another private practice in Royal Oak, Michigan. And we took it on ourselves to say, look, we know that primary PCI is better, but the world doesn't believe it. Rob Califf, Eric Topol, Eugene Braunwald, people thought it was a joke. Okay. And we said the only way we're going to convince people is to do a randomized trial. And so we designed a randomized trial. We had 12 sites, enrolled, 500 patients, and showed a reduction in death and reinfarction in 1 year with primary PCI compared to TPA. And that trial actually changed the world. And I was, on that time, I was not a principal investigator of that study. I was, one of the 12 sites because I knew everybody, but I worked really hard. I didn't have a research nurse. I enrolled all my own patients. I consented every patient. I collected the case report forms for all the patients, et cetera. And I was like the second or third highest enroller. And because of that, I had a lot of motivation and I got to write a lot of the sub-studies that came out of that. Of course, I was on the New England Journal paper, but then I got to write and first author a lot of sub-studies. And then a lot of people got to know me. And that kind of really helped snowball my career to give me a little independent cred as an investigator. And just being that, and through kind of sometimes being obnoxious and kind of forcing my way into things and letting people know I've got to be part of this. It's fantastic. I really love what you're working with. How can I help? Coming with hat in hand, but also being forceful. I've been able to be involved in a lot of different things. And also continued, I will say, interventional cardiology has evolved, last point here, tremendously over the 30 to 35 years I've had an academic career. And it's evolved from coronary intervention to peripheral intervention, and now, of course, to structural heart disease. And you have to evolve along with it. Okay. Coronary intervention is now a very mature subspecialty. There are still some questions we need to answer, but of course, all the excitement right now is in structural heart intervention. And I'm leading a lot of heart failure trials and hypertension trials and now pulmonary hypertension trials. And this has been amazing because these are topics that I didn't know a lot about. And, through clinical research, I've been able to learn and keep abreast and now be at the cutting edge of all of these topics. And so it's been a wonderful career. And the last thing I'll say is I started, probably spending 95% of my time patient care, but doing all the clinical research I possibly could. And it was mostly nights and weekends. And a lot of clinical research is nights and weekends. And then over the years, I've slowly transitioned my career to, 80% patient care, then 70% patient care, then 50% patient care. And now it's to the point where I'm principally doing research and education. And I've done 14,000 interventional procedures and 7,000 or 10,000 angioplasties. I don't know that I can do much more than that. But what keeps it really, really fresh for me is still being able to address and answer a lot of these unknown questions. So that's kind of a little bit about my background and how I've gotten to where I am. And I'd love to hear more about you guys and what some of your questions and issues are as you start to develop your careers.
Thank you. That was really fantastic. We have a couple of questions that have popped up. I'd love to have the people who actually reached out there have the opportunity to ask you directly. Leslie, I think you asked the first one, so be my guest.
Hi, Dr. Stone. Thank you for this amazing talk. It was really inspiring for all of us. I'm a third year fellow going into interventional cardiology next year. And I am currently as a fellow, I'm trying to be involved in prospective trials trying to understand the randomization process and everything. And I'm hoping to do that as an early career physician too. At what point in our career as early career physicians, especially interventional cardiology, where we are also developing skills, do you think it's a good idea to start getting involved in these trials as a site? And when we decide to get involved in these, what are the initial steps we should take to start those relationships and be a site?
Yeah. So, yeah, it's a great time to get involved, and you should do it really early. I'll say that, when I started, randomized clinical trials were few and far between. And I remember, when one of the first randomized trials came out, I was looking at a poster and, looking at a sub-study for a randomized trial, and was standing next to Eugene Brunwald. And he actually said to this was really fantastic, but we're not going to do these kind of studies very often, right? Randomized trial, because they're so expensive and they're so time consuming. But we've learned so much about them being the gold standard, and they're the only way you can control biases in a clinical experiment for the most part, that you do want to learn a lot about it. And how to do randomized trials has gotten very sophisticated. Again, when I did it, we had a paper case report form on the PAMI trial that was, 10 pages long, the whole case report form, no electronic databases, barely sourced documents. And, the protocol was about 10 pages long. I mean, it's really amazing. In fact, it was unfunded. The PAMI trial was not funded. We paid for it by ourselves. We just did it out of time. And we actually, we created an Excel database. Okay. So we did all the statistics from PAMI in Excel. So that's what it was like back then. Now, of course, everything is incredibly complex and sophisticated. The statistics are very important to learn, and statistical analysis is at the heart of understanding how to interpret clinical data and whether or not you'll get accepted. And you can learn all of this in a master's program. For some of you who really want to become clinical trialists, Harvard, Columbia, and a few other places put on, MSc degrees in, clinical trials methodology and biostatistics, et cetera. And they're usually 1 year, sometimes 2 year program. So some of you may want to take that program, take a program like that. I learned it on the fly, because when I started, there were barely chi-squareds and t-tests. Okay. And kind of all of this advanced statistical methodology is kind of developed over the last 30 to 40 years. And I was very fortunate also to have as collaborators and mentors some of the world's best statisticians, like Stuart Pocock and David Demetz and Tom Fleming and others. And I learned so much from them. Cyrus Mehta. I mean, I can go on and on. And so, there's always people that know more than you do about different areas of any field that you're going to be in, and try to take advantage of that. So the bottom line is, yes, you want to become involved. I think if you know that you're going to want to do that, try to become involved as early as possible. Do you know you're in your third year, you're going to do a fourth year? Do you know where you're going, or not yet?
Yeah, next year I'm doing interventional cardiology, where I'm training right now, Allegheny in Pittsburgh.
Oh, so Allegheny in Pittsburgh. So Allegheny in Pittsburgh was one of our first PAMI sites as well. And I don't know if he's around anymore. There was a physician named Brian Donahue. I don't know if you've heard that name. He was a cardiologist and was a great interventionalist and was a great researcher and enrolled a lot of patients. And Allegheny General was a big hospital back then for early interventional cardiology research. I think it's done a little less since then, but one person can turn that entirely around. And again, if what I think you want to do is, as you hear about projects that are of interest to you, whether they're new drugs or whether they're new devices, or, if you hear there's going to be a new big trial of lithotripsy versus atherectomy or something, you want to go and introduce yourselves to either or both the sponsor of the study, the companies, and try to get to know them. and or the principal investigators, and say, "Hi, I'm such and such from Allegheny General. I would love to be a part of this trial. I'm new. I'm just out of my fellowship, but I guarantee you, I'm going to work really, really hard and find as many patients as possible and enroll good patients for you in this study." And that means a lot. When we hear somebody with that kind of enthusiasm. So you be out there. Again, no one's going to come to you. Okay. And no matter whether you're at Harvard or Allegheny or Iowa State, you've got to go to them and you've got to seek out the opportunities. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Great.
Bree, I think I see a question from you in the chat as well.
Oh, in the chat? Okay. Let's see.
I was going to try to see if they were able to answer directly, but if not, there's a
I can look at
question
chat
there as well.
question. How do you recommend balancing clinical research during a procedural fellowship in an early career where you also need to hone in on procedural skills? So that's really important. So especially if you're gonna be a proceduralist, for example, like an interventional cardiologist or a cardiac surgeon, you've got to develop good procedural skills. And like I said, you've got to become a really good practitioner. I don't think there are many top clinical researchers that also weren't really top scale clinical practicing physicians. So early on, for example, if you're going to be an interventional cardiologist, you got to spend a lot of time in the cath lab. And so it's time to, and a cath lab is very consuming. It's long hours, it's a lot of call, etc. But you still want to, again, try to glom on with other people that are doing early projects, because you won't have a lot of time to totally dedicate yourself to research, but you'll be able to do some things. And you do have nights and weekends. And I will say, I honestly gave up a lot of nights and weekends. And the one thing you don't want to talk to me about is work-life balance, because I honestly, I don't have great answers for work-life balance. You've got to find it. It's important. You can't, you can't totally give up on relationships and families and kids, et cetera, to try to maximize everything out of your career. That will make you also a one-sided unhappy person. But there's no getting around that. You will have to make sacrifices. And when myself and my partners have had a lot of success, it always creates some jealousy, and people will always say, why are you guys so successful? And I always tell people the truth. And it's not that we're smarter than anyone else. It's honestly that we work harder. And we're really persistent, and there's no shortcuts. I don't mind telling you, I'm 67 years old. Well, we'll be 67 in a week or two. And I still work every Saturday and Sunday. Okay. And I still love it. I mean, fortunately, I love what I'm doing, but when you're in that early fellowship, or early career phase, there's going to be no substitute where you got to do your day job. You've got to learn your clinical skills, but then you also want to do that research. And a lot of it's going to be nights and weekends. And yes, some of it, if you get involved in a clinical trial program that's going on at your center, you're one of 50 sites, and you talk to the PI at your local hospital and you say, I want to help you. How can I help you? Let me identify patients. Let me screen patients. Let me do this. Let me do that. Anything I can do to help. They'll find something for you to do, but you still will be able to do other things, because you'll be able to write case reports. You're going to see interesting things in the cath lab that is going to fascinate your attending, and it may fascinate you. And you can always write up case reports, and you can always write systematic reviews. And the literature's filled every 3 years. We need a systematic reviews on contemporary drug-eluting stents, or new strategies to reduce infarct size and myocardial infarction. And even if somebody wrote it 3 or 4 years ago, medical knowledge turns over so fast that, again, 3 or 4 years later, it's time for another review. And so you can do that with a mentor, and that's going to be lots of nights and lots of weekends. So again, you have to decide, if you just want to do clinical care, you can probably work, 20 or 30 hours a week less. and become a great interventionalist. And like I said, there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But you'll become unhappy as if you try to do everything. And if you try to become a clinician and a researcher and ultimately an educator, you just got to realize it's going to take a lot of time. Um, there's no shortcuts, at least none that I've ever found. Okay, let's get another question.
I see
Uh,
Adriana has her hand up.
well, I think that was answered. Okay, yeah. Adriana, was it?
Hello, Dr. Stone.
No, we can't hear you.
Adriana, I think your connection may be a bit slow. I'll ask a question in the meantime, Dr. Stone.
Sorry, the internet was kind of down. Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
You
that's
sound
better.
great
Yeah.
now, whatever you did.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for waiting. Hello, Dr. Stone. I'm Adriana Mares. I'm at Yale School of Medicine. My
Great.
question is, really like knowing what you know now about industry relationships, like grant funding for trials, would you have done something different? For example, like doing these types of negotiations at an earlier phase of your training, um, doing any sort of like moves like that at an earlier phase or anything like that?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question. Again, back when I started, there was NIH was funding very, very little clinical research, probably 5%. It was almost all basic science. And they have changed over the years. And now they are funding more and more clinical research. I was one of the co-principal investigators of the ischemia trial, and we got $96 million from NIH to do that trial. And we just received a $30 million grant from Picori to do this new trial that will be starting. So those are great government grants. They take a lot of work, as I mentioned. So when I started, though, I started pretty much really focusing on industry relationships. And it served me well because of the way things have evolved. If I was doing it today, I think I would focus more on trying to find a balance. I would definitely try to develop those industry relationships, but I would also work on NIH, PCORI, HRQ, and other grant opportunities as well. It's the industry grants are not margins are tighter for companies. They are not granting things as liberally as they used to, so it's not as easy to work with industry as it used to be. And on the other hand, there are more government opportunities than there used to be for clinical research. So I would probably try to balance my interests and portfolio. You want to throw a lot of irons in the fire. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, because again, a lot of the things you may submit to industry or NIH, and it's not going to get a good score. And it's not going to get funded, and that's okay. If 1 out of 4 ideas you have ultimately gets funded, you'll be, it's like being a baseball player. You don't have to hit a home run every time. You just need to get a lot of wins over your career. So keep a lot of different ideas going and a lot of irons in the fire.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback on that.
Thank you.
Of course, working with industry can open a lot of doors and tremendous amount of innovation. Um, for cardio nerds, the education we have is sponsored by industry through independent medical education funding. And what we realized is it's just important to have guardrails around how you operate and collaborate with industry, so you can stay true to your mission and your values. So what have you identified, like what are guardrails to establish early on in collaborating with industry? And have you found yourself in any situation where like you may have to backtrack for ethical reasons?
I've been fortunate where the answer is no. I've never had to backtrack for ethical reasons, but I've just always had my eyes open, and I let people know if I'm going to be the principal investigator of a study, then I've really got to run the study. And it's always a negotiation. And there are some times where industry just does not want to do something that you want to do because it's just too expensive or, it doesn't make sense. And they often have very, very smart people. You can learn a lot from the people that are working in industry. And after all, they're going to know more about their devices and drugs than you do, until you really become a world expert at it. And then you may never know as much as they do. So I see industry trials as it's not an antagonistic relationship, it's a collaborative relationship. And I go into thinking that I'm partnering with industry. The best companies are the ones that realize a lot of their trials are not going to be positive. And they'll go on. They'll say, if this is going to be negative, we got to find out. We're going to run the best trial that we can. And companies like Merck and Pfizer, certainly big pharma, they run negative trials all the time, but they're big enough that they can survive those negative trials. I link big pharma a little bit like Hollywood and blockbusters, right? Not every Hollywood big studio movie is a hit, but they only need one blockbuster out of every 5 or 6 movies that they produce, and then they're going to be very happy. So the good companies will do it right, will not cut corners. Um, uh, you may think that you should have a core laboratory for BNP measurements, and that's going to cost another $500,000, and they may push back on that because it's not a central part of the study. So you may say, okay, I can live with, just site reported BNP levels. But on the other hand, if the primary endpoint is echo EFs, you would insist, of course, we need an echo core lab to independently read the ejection fractions for the primary endpoint. And the good companies will go along with that. You want to make sure that, you have access to the data and to the database. I've always insisted on that, and I've never had it denied. I always insist that I write the first draft of a manuscript. I've never let industry write a paper for me. And I've always insisted there's no ghostwriters. If industry is going to ever help write any of it, let's say they're going to write a little bit of the method section, then they become an author. Okay. And then we decide that's the way to do it. And then it's transparent. So you just have to know, you have to set your own guardrails for ethics, and transparency, know where to fight the battle. Again, I've never had to walk away from something because I've experienced any unethical behavior in industry. Yeah, it's really not. Again, I really do view industry as a partner and as a collaborator and somebody who helps patients get better. Because, again, things are so rigorous now that they can't put a device or a drug on the market that's going to harm patients and try to get a short-term profit from it. It doesn't happen. And they know that. And so they're totally aligned with you to try to work to have a positive trial. And you as a trialist, you will often know, this is one thing, you'll often know more than industry will if you become expert as a trialist. And a lot of industries will come to me and want me to be a principal investigator because I will be able to help them design a positive clinical trial. An anecdote that I always tell industry, which is true, is that about 2/3 of all randomized trials are negative. I don't know if you know that. About 2/3 are negative. And I think that of the ones that are negative, I think about half of them are negative because the drug or the device just doesn't work. And the other half are negative because the trial design was bad. And so there is a big responsibility and a lot of value you can bring as an independent researcher and clinical trialist at helping design a trial that's not going to get in the way of finding the right answer. I mean, what a shame if there's a drug or a device that can save lives and you get a negative trial because you designed a poor study. I mean, that's almost criminal, but it happens every day.
Dr. Stone, and this is Dan Emender, one of the other co-founders of CardioNerds. And I have a quick question. You've been doing trials for so many years. And over the years, with social media, has developed and more cardiologists are involved. So, how, earlier on, I'm sure there were a lot of editorials on your research, right? But then as time has gone on and social media has brought people to the public forum, people are quick to critique or comment on trials. What are your thoughts on that? And has that been helpful or harmful for the, current research that you're doing over the years?
Yeah, no, great question. So let's see. Today's Wednesday, so I can give you my Wednesday answer. I may feel differently about it on Thursday and Tuesday. I struggle with social media. I don't have a Facebook page. I don't do LinkedIn, but I do Twitter. And before I did Twitter, it's been about 10 years now. I said I'm never going to do social media because it's just a cesspool and it's not the right way to get out high quality information. And you're not talking to people face by face, et cetera. But then people convinced me, and I think rightfully so, that it's such a powerful way to communicate with a lot of people all at once that I did start to do it. And overall, I'm glad I did. Although people, as you know, will say things on social media that they'll not say in any other venue, and you have to have a very thick skin, which after 10 years, I'm still trying to develop. Because I'm actually a pretty sensitive person. You may not be able to tell that, but it's true. And most of us are actually. But on social media, I mean, again, people will say things are horrendous, and you've got to realize who's credible and who's not, and try to respond accordingly. But that being said, I can give a talk to 200 people at ACC, or I can summarize my talk and put it on cardio Twitter, and I can have 10,000 people look at it in 2 days. And so it's just something that I feel is worth some of the downsides of social media. And I'm sure there's I don't know, I think I have 30,000 followers or something, but there's a lot of people that are much more successful at it than I am. I mean, you look at somebody like Mike Gibson at Harvard, who's got almost 500,000 followers. And we're not anywhere near Taylor Swift type levels, but I've never tried to make a career of figuring out how to really be successful in getting penetrated in Twitter or other social media. But it's probably something that a lot of you, I think, can use and will use in the future very effectively. Um, how AI is going to change all that is also just fascinating to see.
I think we've got time for one last question before we wrap up for the evening. Naima, I see you with your hand up there. Why don't you finish off with the last question?
Thanks. Hi, Dr. Stone. Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I'm currently a second-year cardiology fellow at Temple in Philly, and I'm interested in electrophysiology. So I think for EP as well as like interventional, there's a lot of room for innovation, and we hear about designs for new devices all the time. I have had some of my attendings here actually design catheters. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to, maybe carrying out trials on devices that you might have designed yourself and how the intellectual property
Sure.
plays into the relationship with industry.
Yeah, so it's a complicated question, and the thinking's evolved on that over the years. And every university handles it a little bit differently. But where they're mostly have come down to is that, for first in human studies, when the inventor is the practicing cardiologist in this case, most universities will let them do research with the catheter that they develop, with the rationale being that no one knows it better than they do. And as long as you absolutely let the patient know, 4 ways through Sunday, I invented this. I might, have major financial gains from this, but this is what I think. And then you really let the patient know about that. Most universities will let that happen. When a new device goes farther along, and it's now going to get studied, in a multi-center experience, then most universities will make that inventor step out and have nothing to do, not take care of any of the patients, not put in any of the devices, et cetera, and have to be totally separated from it. Again, every university handles it a little bit differently. That's, I think, in general, the way it works. One of my former partners was, one of the co-inventors of TAVR. Okay. Marty Leon, and had a lot of stock in an early company. And he recused himself from taking care of any of those patients early on. And I don't know exactly, but I'm sure he made a lot of money from it. And God bless him. I mean, he's helped millions of patients by developing that. And so I have no qualms about that, but we just have to do it the right way, to protect patients So people that don't have untoward potential for financial gain can let that, get in the way of, their otherwise thinking when they're interacting with patients.
Thank you again, Dr. Stone. This is really fantastic. I think on behalf of all of us that we've all learned a tremendous amount. It's been fantastic just hearing from you, getting to learn a lot more about your own journey and a lot of advice for people at all different stages, especially early on in their career. It's a little bit of a cardio nerds tradition, but at the end of each of these, we generally take a group photo if you're okay with it for
Yeah, of course.
post on cardio Twitter.
My pleasure.
Now, I'll welcome everyone to turn on your videos. In the meantime, Dr. Stone, thank you so much for spending it with us. This was both inspiring and practical. It's a combination that's sometimes hard to achieve at the same time.
Great.
I'll count to 3.
I've enjoyed it. Thanks. Nice getting to know a lot of you.
1, 2, 3. All right. Very good. Jason, thank you so much for, again, organizing this, your busy schedule. And everyone, thank you for spending part of your Wednesday evening with us. Thank you. Have a good night.